Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Orphan Train Escape by Rachel Wesson, narrated by Ruth, Urquhart. Prologue. New York, 1893, Carmel's Mission. Lily Doherty sang softly as she moved through the rooms of the sanctuary. It had taken the best part of 5 years to get Carmel's Mission, the sanctuary named after her husband's grandmother, working as she hoped. Initially, her project had been met by skepticism. So many New Yorkers believed the poor chose to live in poverty and decay. But she had persevered. With her husband Charlie and Mr. Prentice, Mr. P as she liked to call him, behind her, she hadn't let any setback stop her from moving forward. Dr. Elmwood had also been a huge asset, helping the ladies and children with medical issues free of charge. Finally, things began to change. Word spread among the people she most wanted to reach that the help she offered didn't come with many conditions. She didn't require them to change religions or start attending church in order to be helped. She didn't impose her beliefs on anyone. Yes, she had Father Nelson and Pastor Adams working with her. Both men were similar and believed being a Christian meant you helped all those in need, not just those you considered worthy. Of course, their hope was always that others would see their way of life as the best way and follow suit. It worked, too, as both men saw an increase in attendances at their respective services. Many members of the local community had got behind her idea and had offered their help as well, not only in money but also in labour. They were the people who touched her heart more. The men and women who had toiled all week long, but still gave the sanctuary an hour or so. The women cleaned the rooms and made the large pots of soup she distributed to those in need, as well as the residents of the sanctuary. Lily hoped it would continue, although the numbers requiring her help were rising. She was particularly concerned about the number of children living on the streets. Something more had to be done for them. Charlie was worried about the economy. He had his head stuck in the New York Times again this morning. Where had the happy-go-lucky lad she had married gone? Smiling, she admitted to herself that they had both grown in the last 5 years. Their marriage was a joy to both of them, their respective work a blessing. Charlie helped with legal issues as and when they arose. His employer, a man he had saved in the Great Whiteout of '88, had recognized Charlie's strengths, and his position with the firm was rock solid. She tried to be more positive about the economy, although she had to admit it was scary hearing about the next bank closing. Mr. P also seemed more on edge than usual, and the news from her friends back in Clover Springs, Colorado, was heartbreaking. Both Erin and Ellen had written about the number of miners finding their way to the town, their jobs gone overnight. The price of silver had dropped drastically and was still moving downward. Her office door opened, admitting a matronly lady. Lily smiled at the woman, who worked almost as hard as she did.
"Good morning, Lily. Lovely day, isn't it?" Mrs. Wilson's smile could light up a room. "It is indeed, Mrs. Wilson. How are the ladies?" "Doing much better now you've secured more work for them. They were scared you would send them back onto the streets."
The news about the economy always hit the poor worst of all, as they were the ones to pay a heavier price. When you lived day to day, never having sufficient money to meet all your bills, any reduction in earnings would be devastating. "You know I would never do that." She prayed to God she'd never have to. But if the economy did spiral downwards, would she have enough to keep the sanctuary going? "I know, Lily, but you have to remember not all of them know you like I do. They don't know you were once as poor as they are. They wouldn't believe me if I told them about your past. You are very much a lady now." Lily grinned as she looked at her clothes. If you judged her solely on the way she was dressed, it was obvious she was financially secure. Her dress, whilst modest in fashion, was made of the highest quality cotton. Her hands were lily white and not red raw like many of the women in the soup lines. She was lucky. She'd left a horrible past behind with the help of Doc Erin and Mick Quinn from Clover Springs. They had brought her to New York, where she met Mr. P. Their visit coincided with the biggest tragedy to hit New York. Lily shivered, remembering how many had died during the '88 blizzard. Was it really 5 years ago? Chapter 1. Bridget Collins pushed the lank hair out of her eyes as she stretched her back. Everything ached from her head to her toes, and it wasn't yet midday. She could only imagine how bad it was for the older women who worked here. She was supposed to be in her prime, yet at 19 she felt every year of her age, and 100 more. Oak's Laundry, where she worked, was situated in the basement of a tenement building where fresh air was the stuff of daydreams. She wished she could take a break, but her supervisor, Mr. Webster, was even more on edge than usual. Mr. Oakes Sr., the owner, must be on site. He was strict, although she preferred him to his son. The way young Mr. Oakes looked at her made her want to crawl out of her own skin. She pushed the shirts back into the water, having scrubbed the cuffs and collars with a harsh lye soap. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood in Ireland, like the green open fields she had run through with her brothers and sisters on their way to school. Mam had insisted her children would do better by learning to read and write. Only a proper education gave the poor a chance in life. Poor Mam. Bridget never thought she would be glad her Mam was dead, but it would have killed her to see how her children were faring. Coming to America had been her Mam's dream. She believed in the stories sent back to Ireland from people who had emigrated. This was supposed to be the land of opportunity. Bridget sighed, wondering how people had written home such tales of hope when the reality was so different. Maura, her elder sister, was at home, her heart grieving for her fiancé, killed in the explosion at their work last weekend. In the space of 2 days she had lost not only her job, but her hope for the future. David had idolized Maura, calling her his older woman. He'd been 20 to Maura's 22. He had protected the whole family against the worst of tenement life. Bridget squeezed her eyes shut to stop a tear escaping. She could still see David now, his big blue eyes lit up from inside. He was always smiling. How come the good died young? Her brothers, Shane and Michael, were running wild. She suspected they were involved with one of the many gangs who preyed on the poor. Kathleen, her favourite sister, was slowly going blind sewing buttonholes. Liam, the youngest boy, was out collecting rags as he tried to provide for the family at 6 years of age. He was particularly close to Annie, his junior by 2 years, and couldn't bear to see her go hungry. What would they do?
"Good afternoon, Bridget. You look mighty pretty today."
Bridget stilled, her backbone going rigid at the sound of his voice. She hadn't seen him come in, so he'd caught her by surprise. Pretty. Covered in sweat with lank hair and red raw hands. He needed his eyes tested. "Good afternoon, sir." Her tone was as polite as she could make it without being servile. Yes, he was the son of the boss, but that didn't make him her better. Mam said the goodness of one's heart was the value of a man, not how much money he kept in the bank.
"I need to see you in the office," Mr. Oakes said. "There's been a complaint."
As soon as he walked away, confident she would follow, she wilted. What type of complaint had there been this time? She was sick of his attempts to get her alone. How many times did she have to tell him she was a good Catholic girl? What he wanted from her was for her husband alone. She pulled the tub away from the heat and, wiping her stinging hands on her apron, walked slowly to the office. She could feel the eyes on her back, although anyone checking on the women would think they hadn't stopped working. The tension in the air was palpable. Those who had worked for Oak's Laundry and Sewing for years knew what being summoned to the office meant. For the men, it was bad news. For the women, the younger ones anyway, it was a lot worse. She saw a couple of women cross themselves and hoped they had shared a prayer for her as well. She pushed her shoulders back. Whatever he threatened her with this time, she still wasn't going to give in to him. Never.
"There you are," he said as she entered his office. "The walk across the floor seems to take you longer each time, Bridget."
She ignored the reprimand, but stood with her hands balled at her sides, her fingernails hurting the insides of her palms. His grey-blue eyes, almost colourless, were fixated on her chest as he addressed her. She glanced at his suit, the golden chain from his watch hanging from the pocket of his waistcoat, another reminder of how wealthy he was. She glanced at his face momentarily, thinking of the comments someone from the factory floor had made about him wishing to model his appearance on the Prince of Wales. She had never seen a picture of the prince, but wondered if his wife thought a full beard and long whiskers to be attractive. It certainly didn't suit Mr. Oakes, making him look even uglier than his behaviour. The office door closed behind her, shutting off most of the noise of the shop floor. The air in the office would have been sweeter than that of the laundry but for his presence. There was a pervading sense of evil about him, something she couldn't explain in words. She refused to look him in the eye. Instead, she stared at a point above his head.
"Why don't you sit down, Bridget, and have some soup? It's delicious."
The smell of the soup stirred her stomach. She hoped it wouldn't start grumbling. She didn't want the man to know how hungry she was. But if he thought she was going to sell herself for some food, he was wrong. It was time to try to take a little control back. She was an employee, not his servant, or at least it was supposed to be that way. "You mentioned a complaint, sir."
"Yes, but not against you, Bridget. Your work is always to the highest standard."
What was she doing in his office, then? He hadn't said her work was of high quality when she got demoted from the sewing department to the laundry. But she kept her mouth shut and waited. He had something on his mind. She could tell by the tone of his voice. He was baiting her. To him she wasn't a person, but a plaything, something to amuse himself with when he got bored, and she wasn't the first. When she started in the laundry, the girl called to the office on several occasions was Mary Rourke. Mary, who ended up in the Hudson River, her swelling abdomen evidence of her so-called crime. Poor Mary, she'd been desperate. This evil man had told her she had to pay for her father's mistakes. The same father who had thrown his own daughter out when the evidence of what she had done came to light. But Bridget wasn't Mary.
"You aren't curious about why you are in here?"
he asked. "I expect you will tell me, sir." She had to be careful. Her temper was rising and it could easily cost Bridget her job. Her pay wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the roof over their heads when combined with what Kathleen earned. They depended on what young Liam earned from rag-picking to supplement the cost of food.
"A girl in the sewing section?"
Her heart thumped when he didn't complete his sentence. She could feel his eyes boring into her body. She knew he was talking about Kathleen, but she was a good girl. She wouldn't give cause for complaint unless someone had done something to her. "If you have touched her, you—" she spat.
"Bridget Collins, remember yourself. You know I wouldn't put a finger on such an insipid creature. I prefer my women to have fire in their bellies. Makes for a much more satisfying arrangement, if you catch my drift."
He wasn't exactly subtle. Of course she understood him.
"But as a complaint was made, we had no choice but to send your sister home. Her position has already been filled."
Her stomach dropped at the same time as her heart started beating faster. He'd fired Kathleen. Now, at a time when jobs were like gold dust. Her family couldn't survive without Kathleen's wages. But then he would know that. He was using the situation to remind her he held complete power over her future and that of her siblings. Her fingernails dug deeper into her palms.
"Don't you have something to say?" he asked.
"No, sir." She wasn't going to apologize. Kathleen hadn't done anything wrong, she was sure of it. The 16-year-old girl was too shy and afraid of her own shadow to cause trouble. Mam used to say Kathleen was born with a heart too sensitive for this world. He moved closer to her, blocking her exit. She stepped away from him until the office table prevented her escape. He pushed a strand of hair away from her face while she held her body rigid so it wouldn't flinch. She wasn't going to show him any fear. He delighted in making people fear him.
"Now tell me, Bridget, how will we make this situation work? I've been told to fire you as well. We have to make an example to show the other workers that laziness and poor workmanship will not be tolerated."
She stared over his shoulder, refusing to rise to his tricks. They both knew there wasn't a lazy bone in her sister's body, but protesting that wouldn't change anything. He moved so close it was almost as if the only thing separating them were their clothes. She could feel his breath on her neck, his expensive cologne making her nostrils sting.
"Bridget, we could have so much fun together. You wouldn't go hungry. You might be able to afford a nicer home. Your brothers wouldn't be in danger of being locked up."
She couldn't help flinching. What did he know of Michael and Shane?
"Yes, I know your brothers. In fact, I may have mentioned my concerns to a couple of friends on the force. They can't be allowed to prey on the poor, making people's lives miserable with their thieving, drinking, and debauchery."
If she had been anywhere else, she may have been amused by the irony of this man using these terms about someone else. Isn't that what he did every day?
He may not steal in the conventional sense, but keeping his workers locked in this basement for 12 hours a day and paying them a pitiful wage was a different form of stealing, wasn't it?
You will have to be very nice to me, Bridget. I hold the power to destroy your little family. Although it would pain me, believe me, I will do it.
Pain you? Nothing could make you feel anything with a heart of iron. You won't get anything from me, Stephen Oakes. I told you before, and I will tell you again. My body isn't for sale, not at any price.
He grinned, making her stomach roil. Now we both know that isn't true. Every woman has her price. For women of my class, it's marriage and a suitable home. In return, they know they have to fulfill their duty. For women of your class, some good food usually is enough for them to—
Not me. I was brought up better than that. Now do your worst, but you won't have me.
He trailed his lips along her neck, leaving her skin wet as he gripped her arms savagely.
Believe me, I will. I always get what I want.
Desperate, Bridget's hands flew behind her. There must be something on the desk she could use to defend herself. His grip on her tightened as his lips moved all over her face. She refused to let him kiss her, causing him to call her a horrible word. He pushed himself against her. Time was running out. Her fingers grabbed wildly on the desk, finally finding something sharp, a letter opener. She grabbed it without thinking and slashed at him. The element of surprise was on her side. Her aim was off, but she still managed to slice his ear. His blood dripped over her hand just as he cried out and moved slightly away, his focus on his injury. She pushed him farther and ran to the door. Opening it, she flew from the office and didn't stop until she was halfway home. What had she done? He was bound to report her, and then what would happen to her family? She picked up her skirts and fled home, back to the tenement building. Chapter 2.
Bridget, what happened? Kathleen came home and went to bed without a word,
Bridget's eldest sister, Maura, said. Bridget didn't stop as she stepped inside their room in the tenement. She didn't even close the door behind her in her usual attempt to block out the disgusting stench.
Maura, pack up everything,
she said, fighting to remain calm. We have to get out of here now.
But why? Where will we go?
Maura whined.
I don't know, but the police will be here soon. They will put the children in the asylum and— Oh, Maura, I'll tell you later, but please get ready. We don't have much time.
Bridget saw Kathleen get out of bed and dress quickly. She sent her white-faced sister out to find Liam and Annie.
Where will we go?
Maura repeated, standing still as if they had all the time in the world.
This is our home.
Bridget glanced around the windowless room that had sheltered them for the last 3 years, ever since Daddy had lost his job on the railways. Kathleen had covered the biggest cracks with newspaper in an effort to make the hovel homelier. The newspapers didn't keep out any of the sounds around them. The rats' claws scraping against the plaster, their high-pitched squeaks as they fought each other for dominance. She didn't know which was worse, the noise of the rats, the drunken neighbours singing bawdy sounds, or the noisy love-making that seemed to follow. It was impossible to know how many people lived in these tenements. The multi-storey brick building had been built years before for far grander purposes, and certainly wasn't designed to hold so many immigrants. Now each room was tenanted, sometimes by more than one family. Bridget knew they had been lucky not being forced to share their room with strangers. Lucky. If Daddy hadn't fallen foul of the landlord, wrongly accused of a crime, their lives would have been so much better in Ireland. They had been poor, but happy. The air had been fresh and there was more room to move around. If she closed her eyes, she could see her mam spinning wool in the evening, exchanging a warm smile with their daddy sitting by the fire. Bridget's mam had been a powerhouse of energy, by day working as a seamstress in the big house, and in her spare time she had raised chickens, selling the eggs at the local store. Sometimes she sold cheese and brown bread at the market. Now mam and daddy were dead, and all they had left was each other. Bridget reined in her impatience with her sister. Maura was the eldest, but she was behaving worse than Annie, her 4-year-old sister. Thankfully, Bridget had thought about where they should go on her run back home. They would go to Father Nelson at the church. He would help them. He had to. He'd believe she was only protecting herself, wouldn't he? He wasn't like the previous priest. He was different. She had to take a chance on him. It was their only option. They certainly couldn't stay here, just waiting to be picked up.
"Where are Michael and Shane?" she asked her sister.
"Out, as always."
Maura's resigned reply spoke volumes as she poked at the fire. Maura had started dinner, lighting a small fire on the paving stones in the corner of the room. The smoke made everyone's eyes water, but it was the only way to cook the potatoes which were baking in the embers. Maura had done all the cooking since David had died. It was all she did. The boys ran wild, but in fairness, even David hadn't managed to control the boys. They were old enough to fend for themselves, being 15 and 17.
"We can't wait for them. I'll send Colm Fleming to find them and tell them not to come back here but to head straight for the church. Mrs. Fleming may use the room. We've paid for the next 2 weeks.
Bridget looked around the small room they used as a bedroom, kitchen and everything else. If only she hadn't met the rent collector last evening. She would have that money to tide them over. But she couldn't live by "if only." It raised more questions than it answered.
"Oh, Bridget, I can't believe this. David was so sure things were turning around for us, and now it's all gone wrong. I just can't do it. I can't."
Bridget watched in horror as her elder sister descended into a fit of screaming. She slapped Maura hard on the face.
"Pull yourself together. You are the eldest, not me. Ma'am depended on us to protect the young ones."
Maura stared at her resentfully, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she took the potatoes out of the fire and threw clay on the embers to put it out. Bridget packed up their pitiful belongings, and within 15 minutes of Bridget coming home, the room was empty. Kathleen came back with the younger children. All remained tight-lipped as they looked from Bridget and Maura to the bags at their feet.
"We have to go and see Father Nelson about a new home. It's time for a change,"
Bridget said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. She didn't want to scare the young uns.
"I like it here. Mrs. Fleming is nice to us. Why do we have to leave?"
Liam asked, his hand in Annie's. The little girl sucked her other thumb, her eyes wide with fear. Bridget's heart clenched with hate for Mr. Oakes and his like. This was the only home the children remembered, and now they were losing that too.
"Don't worry, Liam. The next house will be nicer, I promise."
She crossed her fingers, hoping she would be proved right. Looking over the child's head at the dirty, damp walls, it wouldn't take much to find somewhere nicer to live. Mrs. Fleming wished them well, hugging all of them as she dabbed at her eyes with her apron.
"Don't you worry about nothing, darlings. I will tell them fellas you enter family in Jersey. By the time they chase after that goose, you will have flown. May God have mercy on their souls, as straight to the devil they will go for preying on such lovely girls as yous. Thank God your poor mam is dead and buried."
They trudged through the streets. Nobody commented on their sorry little procession, too wrapped up in their own survival. Father Nelson was in the church when they arrived. Bridget told him the full story of what had happened, watching his facial expressions closely. At one point he looked so furious she took a step back from him.
"Bridget Collins," he said, "never be afraid of standing up for yourself. You are not to blame. If I wasn't a man of God, I would... Well, the least said about that, the better. Let's go and see what my lovely housekeeper can rustle up for you. A full belly will make you all feel better."
"Father, what if the police come here?"
"You let me worry about that, young Bridget. I have some very good friends on the force myself. The man you are running from isn't the only one with connections. Come on, child, take that look off your face. You are all safe here."
Bridget wanted to believe him, but she couldn't. She knew how it worked. The rich always won. But her younger siblings didn't need to know how she felt. She forced a smile on her face and gathered them together as they followed the priest into his house. His housekeeper's reception wasn't as warm. She stared at them. Looking through her eyes, Bridget could see the reason for her distaste. They were all filthy, and the younger ones' heads were crawling. But what could they do? There was no running water in the hovel they called home, never mind soap. Bridget pushed her hair back. They had done their best.
Mrs. Reardon, these poor children are running from evil. They need our help. A decent meal followed by a hot bath and a good scrub is what's in order. You provide the meal, and we will look after everything else later."
"Yes, Father Nelson."
"Now, I need to go out. I shall return shortly. Bridget, could you come with me, please?"
Torn between wanting to stay with her siblings and doing what the priest asked, Bridget hesitated. Maura wasn't being particularly helpful, but even she wouldn't let any harm come to the children, would she? Father Nelson misinterpreted her reluctance to go with him. He assumed she was hungry.
"Have some food first, and then we will go together. Your family will be safe here. Mrs. Reardon may not smile much, but sure, the woman has a heart of gold,"
Father Nelson whispered. Bridget looked at the housekeeper and hoped he was right. Maybe the lady was someone who found it hard to show her feelings. Chapter 3. Lily had just finished her dinner when she had a knock on the door.
"Mrs. Doherty, Father Nelson and a young woman are here to see you," Peters, her butler, informed her.
"Send them in, Peters, and ask cook to make some tea. You know how Father Nelson likes her baking."
"Yes, ma'am."
Lily smiled at Peters. Despite the fact that he knew her story, he insisted on treating her like gentry. He told her she was the reason he was still alive. When they had first met during the aftermath of the blizzard, he had had nothing to live for. His family were long gone, and he'd lost his job. She'd offered him a position as soon as he recovered his health. His friend Mary was taken on as the cook. Both lived in the servants' quarters and worked their hardest to keep Lily and her husband comfortable. They were so loyal, you would often find both of them lending a hand at the sanctuary on their days off. Peter helped to amuse the children, while Mary helped cook prepare meals for the people sheltering there. "Father Nelson, how nice to see you," Lily greeted, "but on such a terrible night. You're both soaked through. Come in and warm yourselves by the fire. Peters has gone for some tea and some of Cook's baking."
"Words to warm the cockles of my heart, Lily darling," Father Nelson said, beaming. "This lovely young woman is a friend of mine. Bridget Collins, meet Lily Doherty."
Lily shook Bridget's hand, but what she really wanted to do was to give the poor girl a hug and wipe the desperation and fear from her eyes. "Come in, please. I'm afraid Charlie has to work this evening, but he may come down later. They have a rather big case on their hands."
"Charlie is Lily's lovely husband. He works for Harrington Law and Investigative Services," Father Nelson explained to Bridget.
Lily glanced at Bridget again. The poor girl looked as if she would fall over. "Can I offer you something more substantial than tea? Cook made some wonderful soup earlier."
"No, thank you, Lily. We ate before we came out," Father Nelson explained. "Bridget, you can trust Lily 100%. She will help you, I promise that."
"In any way I can, Bridget," Lily confirmed.
"Bridget had a very unpleasant experience today. It seems the son of her boss tried to take advantage of her. It wasn't the first time, but today he pushed her too far. In self-defense, she struck him with a letter opener. He may have been injured as she thinks she drew blood. He had already fired her sister and threatened her brothers with the law. Wisely, she gathered up her younger siblings and brought them to the church."
"Oh, you poor girl. What an ordeal. Who did you work for?" "Mr. Oakes, ma'am," Bridget answered. "Call me Lily, please. I have heard of Mr. Oakes. He is known for being a hard taskmaster, but I never heard rumours of him chasing his staff." "It's the son, ma'am. I mean Lily. He tried this before, not just with me. My friend, well, she was a good bit older than me. Used to look after us kids when we were younger and Ma'am was working. Her name was Mary Rourke." Lily looked to the priest as the name rang bells.
"Yes, it's the girl we found in the Hudson shortly after I moved to this parish. She was in the family way. Her parents put her out on the street. Father Donnelly condemned her. The poor child believed she had no alternative."
Lily tried to stamp on the revulsion and anger she felt toward Father Donnelly, the priest who had used his position to abuse the poor he was supposed to look after. It would do Bridget no good at all to discuss that sad time. She took Bridget's hands in hers and could feel her shaking. "Listen to me, Bridget. You are safe, and nobody is going to hurt you. We will help. Tell me about your family." "I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Well, That's what's left of us. Mara is 22. I am 19. Michael is 17. Kathleen's 16 and Shane is 15. The two youngest are 6 and 4, Liam and Annie. Michael and Shane are all...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?